Hi, everyone. MPP Jeremy Roberts here with our latest COVID facts video. And this week, we're going to be touching on a really important topic, and that's COVID variants of concerns, or VOCs, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard a lot about in the news these days. And I'm delighted to be joined today by two very special guests. Let me take a moment to introduce them. First, from right here in Ottawa, we have Dr. Doug Manuel, who is a senior scientist at the Ottawa Hospital, specializing in public health and clinical epidemiology. He's also a distinguished professor at the University of Ottawa School of Medicine. Doug, delighted to have you with us.
Delighted to
We
be here,
also
Jeremy.
have Thank you. We also have Dr. Gerald Evans, who is the chair of the Division of Infectious Diseases at Queen's University and the medical director of Infection Prevention and Control at Kingston Health Sciences Center. Gerald, thank you so much for being here with us as well.
Thanks.
So we're going to dive right into it. And the first question I want to tackle is sort of a general information question. So we hear this term variant quite often in the news these days when we're talking about COVID-19. So I'm wondering if you guys could dive a little bit into what exactly is a variant. And when we talk about COVID-19 variants, which ones are here now? Perhaps Dr. Manuel, will turn it over to you to start.
Well, one interesting development this week is trying to name these little devils more clearly, and right in that transition. And I'm trying to do it myself. So first thing, we're starting to try to name them with Greek alphabets: alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and we're probably going to talk about alpha and delta. Alpha would be formerly known as B1117. From UK, and then Delta is the new one from India, B1617.2. So first thing is the nomenclature. I think of it as genetic drift. These things will evolve over time, and there's a lot of pressure. You were taught in school that giraffes got a longer neck as they competed for those taller and taller trees. Well, the viruses compete against each other too. The different variants or strains compete against each other too. And they would just want to survive. So you can think of it, for instance, like transmissibility. If you can replicate, if you can infect a human more easily, then you got a better chance of surviving than the virus next to you. And so there's these evolutionary pressures. And unfortunately, a lot of these evolutionary pressures just work against us. Make make SARS-CoV-2 more transmissible, so it spreads more quickly, more virulent, what we call in business virulent, which means that you get sicker more, die more. And then we worry a lot about immunity. So as we vaccinate more and more people, we get worried that there's going to be evolution, and the viruses that can evade your immune system, evade the vaccine, well, they're going to do a better job. So there's going to be immune pressures or evolutionary pressures to have what we call, immune breakout or immune evasion. So we have all this sort of evolution and genetic change. It's all working against us. It's not, well, most of it's working against us. There's some indication through evolution it may become less severe. If you kill off the human, you're not going to replicate. So actually, but you don't know. It can play out in different ways. So it's hard to predict what will exactly come down. But our evolutionary biologists said it's going to come sooner or later. We're going to see these viruses mutate, and it's going to create headwinds for us for these different sort of areas that I've described.
Sure. Dr. Evans, did you want to jump in with some more background information?
Sure. I mean, Doug did a really great job of explaining, really this, if you understand anything about what Charles Darwin talked about, that's exactly what we're talking about, which is survival of the fittest. But I think people need to understand that the virus isn't working to mutate. Mutation is a common problem that happens in all viruses. And the more they replicate, the more chance they have to turn over a cycle within a cell to produce more of their progeny, the more likely you're going to see those random mutations arising. And we know what the mutational frequency is, how often that happens. And when you have a lot of infections around the world, you are going to see the emergence of these random mutations, many of which are actually not favorable to the virus, but many, or certainly some, which are. And as Doug was just explaining, if it's a favorable mutation that allows the virus to be more transmissible amongst the species that it's infecting, then those are going to predominate over time. And that's really the whole issue about variants. There's nothing fancy. Influenza virus does this, and in fact, influenza virus does it way more frequently than a coronavirus like SARS-CoV-2 does. But this is the natural problem of replication. So really an important strategy I think people should be aware of is that if we can drive infections down as quick as possible, then those lack of viral replication cycles occurring in millions of people around the world, those random mutations will have less and less an opportunity to arise. And if that happens, then in fact, in a way, our ability to control the virus will increase. So really getting case numbers down is incredibly important. And when those case numbers fall, the opportunities for those mutations to arise, producing the variants, will ultimately disappear.
Sure. Now, both of you touched on this second question a little bit in your answers, but Gerald, perhaps I'll go back to you. When you talk about transmissibility, you're talking, I guess, about how the virus spreads, and in terms of how they can also interact with different vaccines as well. So when we talk about these variants, can they in fact be more dangerous? And are the vaccines still necessarily effective against the variants?
Right. So these are really probably I would say the kind of questions that Doug and I get thrown at us all the time with concerns that people have. So it's really important to understand that the traits may not be interchangeable. A virus that's more transmissible is not necessarily more nasty or virulent, as Doug was mentioning. And same thing is that even if it's more transmissible, it might still be very susceptible to either immunity that arises naturally from having had the infection before, or it could still be effective from a vaccine that you've received already. And actually with the alpha variant, the B117, we seem to see that the immunity that we get from vaccine is just as effective as it was against the original strains of SARS-CoV-2 that arose last year. With some of the variants, beta, which is the B1351, that's the one that arose originally, or at least was described originally from South Africa, there is a little bit of diminished effect from immunity, but vaccine immunity still seems to work in the vast majority of people. Delta, the variant that's the more recent one that we're worried about, the B16172, it seems that one shot is not as protective as we would hope, but two shots looks like it's as effective. So the immune escape phenomenon, again, doesn't necessarily carry with it issues around virulence and nastiness or transmissibility. And it's important to understand that transmissibility sometimes is a feature of the virus simply because the virus has had a mutation that allows it to attach to a receptor that's present in humans on the cells of the respiratory tract, which allows it to gain a foothold and probably allows for less viral particles to initiate an infection than what we saw with the original one. It doesn't tell us a lot about the mode. The mode of transmission is probably similar across the board for all of these viruses, but obviously if less virus is required to set up an infection because the ability to bind to that cell receptor by the virus requires less viral particles, then that usually results in more transmissibility. And that's really important too, because at some point, Doug is certainly going to talk to us about, the impact of public health measures and how they've really helped. But that combined with the fact that right now, at least, most of the variants that we've seen do not seem to demonstrate some evasion from the immune response, at least induced by vaccines, tells us that these are complementary means of controlling the virus. So that's my sort of basic pitch at variants in general, so that people understand.
Sure. And of course, so important to talk about preventing the spread of infections, as you said. And we're going to get onto the public health measures in a moment. But Doug, wondered if you had anything to add on that second question, perhaps anything that we've learned about how these variants have developed and played out in other jurisdictions?
I don't actually have that much. I mean, maybe back up to that first question, like building off what you're asking, this is a global challenge. And so when we have these variants, it's not only keeping low here, but we're going to still keep seeing variants until we get low globally. And I'm really concerned about what's going to be playing out over the next few months. We've seen in India, we're having seen in Vietnam, South America is having a lot of challenges, and we haven't even seen yet what's going to unfold in Africa and Indonesia and other countries. And that we're going to have very high rates until we can really control it everywhere. And that the variants are going to keep on there's going to continue to be mutations. So not only low here for sure, but low globally. So really, we're on this little blue-green marble together, and we're going to get through this one way or another together.
For sure, for sure. Well, maybe we'll pivot now to sort of the last question I had, which is, why are the public health measures that we have in place, things like masking and social distancing, still important when we think about the development of variants and trying to keep as many of us safe as possible?
Well, I could take that one first. One thing, it's sort of we all want a vaccine, and vaccines are going to be incredibly important. But remember, first thing is that wearing masks and keeping your distance and keeping outside, that's as effective as a vaccine for preventing this. If you can follow these basic measures that we've been talking about, you're doing pretty well. You're reducing your chance of having COVID 80 or 90%. So the same as 2 doses of vaccine. So it may be, cold comfort, but for those folks that feel they can't, they're waiting for their vaccine, hopefully you're going to be able to protect yourself. And everyone's been doing a pretty good job with it. The challenge, I would say too that, Jeremy, as we speak, we're all getting anxious, and we're all getting outside. When I go around the city, I see we talk about 2 out of 3, and we're kind of 1 out of 3. Get outside, keep your distance, and wear your mask. And I think we're doing the get outside better. But I'm at the park and I'm seeing multiple families together for hours, close distances. So we're actually not doing it right now as well in our area as we could. Where our R0 isn't as good as the rest of Ontario or rest of Canada. And so we got to keep those basics on. The challenge is it's just exhausting, and it's not human nature, and we're asking so much of people. So that's where the vaccine comes in. I think it makes life easier, where potentially, if we can get high enough vaccination rates, then you can take off the mask and you can give your grandparents a hug if you're a grandchild, So the vaccines are great, and there's going to be no substitution, but don't forget the basics that got us this far. If it wasn't for what we were doing, there'd be, it would be a completely different world. The challenges with the new variants that we're asking, what you need to do is going from very good or excellent to phenomenal. It's just that much more transmissible, that it's going to be not as close distance or not as close to space where we're starting to see transmission. But the basics still work, and they'll work for essentially we expect them to work across the variants as they come. They're going to be,
sure.
Yeah.
Well, and I think we all want to work to prevent a fourth wave, and we certainly, when we think about variants and think about potentially more dangerous, potentially more transmissible, and potentially varying impacts of vaccines against them, just goes to reinforce how important all of these measures, both the public health measures, social distancing, masking, alongside the vaccination strategy, both of those are still important for folks. Gerald, perhaps over to you just for any last thoughts on this topic of variants.
Yeah, very quickly, just expand a little bit with what Doug said. I said, so public health measures work really, I know it's a fancy expression, synergistically with vaccine. They both complement each other amazingly well. If we end up with a problem of a variant coming out with immune escape, then those public health measures, as Doug was just mentioning, they're incredibly important. And really what vaccine is giving us is that opportunity. My view is that over the next year, we're looking at a transition period. If we maintain high vaccination rates, increase them, get a lot of the population infected, we will be able, especially here in Canada, to start looking at some removal of those public health restrictions. If, however, a variant were to arise that our vaccine wasn't effective against, then we're going to have to revert back to those. So we really are, in my view, in a sort of transitional period, hoping again that a variant doesn't arise that produces problems with our vaccination as a strategy, and then we'll be able to emerge out of this. So I really have been telling people, don't expect a dramatic end to the pandemic. Expect this sort of transitional period where we're going to have to continue with those important public health measures because they work, as Doug was outlining, very effectively. And as we get vaccine rolled out and get everybody fully vaccinated across the country.
For sure. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for helping us understand and tackle this this complicated issue. Your insights were very much appreciated. And bottom line, we all got to keep doing our best to following the guidelines and make sure we get vaccinated as soon as we're eligible. But again, thank you to you both for taking time out of your busy schedules, and thank you for all of the work that both of you are doing to keep our community safer.
Thanks, Jeremy.